family and building community. The Old Testament community, which forms the basis of our religious beliefs primarily here in Barbados, sets out the foundation for the exercise of reproductive rights within the story of Genesis chapter 1 in creation, where God simply gives man the freedom to be fruitful and multiply. But Genesis 2 reins it in a little bit to remind us, okay, it's good to be fruitful and multiply, but it takes place within a context. It takes place within the context of the family, with the purpose of building the community, and thus set the pattern for the population policy of the Old Testament community, because the Old Testament community is one built on a relationship with God, which they call the covenant. And the covenant had two strands. One, if they were faithful, God will give them a piece of land, but it also came with population growth. I'll make you a great nation, greater than the number of the grain of sand on the seashore and the stars in the sky. And therefore, within the context of covenant in the Old Testament, you therefore had to have the protection of sexual reproductive rights and freedoms. They had to be controlled. And they became controlled in the sense that women did not necessarily have the freedom to exercise those rights as they wished, because women were chattel. They were the properties of their father, who would later sell them to their husbands, and then they became the property of their husbands. So their reproductive rights were constrained within that relationship. But in addition to that, it also had implications for the man, because since their population policy is based on a relationship with Yahweh, the man does not have a right over his own body in terms of how he uses his reproductive matter either, because the seed is really Yahweh's seed and not the individual's. And that's where a lot of the laws in the Old Testament are premised. That law that people like to quote from Leviticus 18 and verse 22, a man shall not lie with a man, is not necessarily about what we think it's about. It's about the wastage of seed, that you cannot engage in a practice that wastes Yahweh's seed because it's not yours. And that's why there's no law, no corresponding law about two women lying together, because as far as they're concerned, they can't do much. They're still the properties of their father. They have to, when the father is ready, he sells you and you make sure you get some children. That was their law. Likewise, the sin of onanism in Genesis 38, where they developed the whole notion of the Levirate marriage, where if your older brother died and he had no children, his brother after him should come and have a child with the woman so that the brother's name will not be blotted out in Israel. And Onan, the son of Judah, refused to perform that rite for his sister-in-law Tamar. Every time he laid with her, he would engage in what you call coitus interruptus and allow the seed to fall to the ground, and God slew him. Because again, it is not yours to waste. It is Yahweh's. So the whole reproductive policy in the Old Testament community was based on this covenant relationship. And this covenant relationship was lived out within the context of family and the building of community. So sexual reproductive rights, yes, you're an individual, but the individual was responsible to the community in terms of reproduction. The New Testament community is somewhat different, because their notion of covenant is not based on building a physical nation. And so their whole concept is different. But in the New Testament community, intercourse was to be for only one purpose, and that is reproduction. There's this thing about having fun and all that. It was not for that. It was about reproduction and production of children. And that's why in the early church, women beyond the age of childbearing could not marry. They were not allowed to get married because, as Basil the Great said, if a man marries such a woman, it's like plowing rocky soil. You won't be able to produce anything, and the whole thing was about reproduction. I have laid that foundation, sir, just to make the point that that particular community had its own policy about building its population, and it was within the context of an understanding that intercourse and reproduction is sacred, and it is premised upon your relationship with Yahweh. Fast forward to our time, we came up in a Judeo-Christian community, but our circumstances and our culture is totally different now. There's no way we can go and tell a young woman that she does not have agency over her own body. And that, I mean, you could try. As the dynamics of the biblical community would have been. But that notwithstanding, we know that in our past, there were people, we have a culture of very large families. In fact, I attended a function the other day where a young woman at 90 was one of 11. And that was the nature of Barbadian families. But then we have to take into account our development as a people. I can remember one Calypsonian who was very popular, singing sometime back in the 80s, "Thou shalt not kill." It's against the abortion bill. In the name of the Lord, don't fear the maternity ward. I got that right, sir? Johnny, my boy. Way back in the 1980s, huh? We also have a culture, because women have agency over their bodies, they can also make choices about their sexual reproductive rights. And we know in Barbados that there is space for legal abortions and so on. And so we have to take that into consideration when we talk about our population policy. In fact, just in 2023, Barbados had just about over 400 abortions. So when we multiply that, when we take that throughout the years, we can see that that may have contributed in some way to the population crisis that we have at this point in time. But I just want to commend the drafters of this policy. It is wide-ranging, it is comprehensive, and it shows that a great deal of thought went into it, particularly in the areas of the goals. With our first goal, which deals with citizenship, expanding the scope of citizenship and migration and so on, that speaks to the need to, the urgency with which we need to grow our population. But I also want to add the caution that Senator Walters would have added, because let us not forget that the most recent election in the US, one of the most important issues was immigration. And what immigration speaks to is not just that you don't want people in, but the question is, how will these people alter the culture and the dynamic of your society? And it came with a bit of fear, as we would have expected, and we saw the results of that. So we too have to be very careful. I mean, we know only too well how Barbadians felt just maybe over a decade ago or so, when we had a certain group of people here in large numbers, and then there were some very derogatory things being said about them. They were treated in ways that you would not want Barbadians to be treated if they had to go anywhere, you see. So we have to be cognizant of that when we deal with migration. And I have no doubt that whichever administration will be in power at the time, that we in Barbados have the ability to manage this in a way that will see after the needs of everyone. So I understand that particular area. What I'm really impressed about is the sub-goal 1.2, which speaks to enhancing family well-being to support reproductive and decision-making. I think this is a very important area for us, because one of the things I've been very concerned about, even though I have not had a study on it, just dealing with anecdotal matters, the seemingly anti-family approach of some of our businesses in this country, where young women feel that they cannot express their fecundity, they cannot express their sexual rights and reproduce because of the negatives that it will bring in terms of their promotion and upward mobility in the company. I think we need to deal with that. Even if it's just one instance, it's one instance too many. Because we cannot build the type of society we want where women are fearful or feel that they cannot have a child at this point in time because they cannot progress in life. Having a family and having children should become a celebrated thing in our society. It is something that we should cherish. We should be happy when women have children and encourage them to have children and encourage them to build families. But if we're having companies that will punish, and I'm saying punish here in inverted commas, a woman simply because she's pregnant and she has to be out for a few months or whatever to make sure the child is properly weaned, then that is not the type of society we want to build in Barbados, you know. And so I call for us to become a more family-friendly country where people are encouraged. I am happy to see that they are, well, there's a point towards the possibility of incentives for having a family. And I know this is something that other nations have tried and were successful at. In fact, I happened to be in the United Kingdom in the year 2017 when they put a cap on the benefits for the number of children you have. And they put the cap that we'll stop at 2 children. If you go beyond that, so yeah, we'll stop at 2 children. If you go beyond that, that's at you. I always remember the morning I went to Mass in church, and the priest, obviously, he had a couple children because he was livid. He couldn't believe how the government could just change this bill like this and put people in the jeopardy that they would have been in. So they too had incentives for having children to help to grow their nation. And having children is not just about creating statistics. It's about creating families. It's about extending the culture of the country. And so these are things that I'm happy to see that we have here in this bill. We need to create more family-friendly workspaces, as has been pointed out, so that we have daycares that are close to work centers, etc., to encourage people that it is okay to have your children, it is okay to have them here. Of course, all of this comes with dealing with other issues, because this population policy then has to touch areas like cost of living and all the other things that we have to deal with. So it's a holistic approach that we must have to national development. And as Senator Walters rightly said, and Senator Blackman, it is coming at the right time. We're on the cusp of celebrating yet another year of self-governance and self-determination. And these are the types of issues that should occupy our mind and our time at this point in time. What is also commendable in this particular resolution is the attention being paid to health care and care of the elderly. I think we've debated this so many times that I need not rehash it, but just to say, remember that we are an aging population. I just did some statistical studies for my deanery in the church, and one of the things that I recognize is that in our census of 2010, the Anglicans in Barbados, 44% of the Anglicans were over the age of 50. And so our population, our congregations are the ones that we're speaking about here in terms of health care. And so as a church, we have to look at how we will seek to provide facilities and so on to care for our members, but we want to encourage the rest of the population to do the same. And I'm very happy that this has been placed here in this population policy, because it's not just about growing the population, it's about caring. It's about providing an environment where we're living as a family and as a community. I've often said that we chide people, and I'm not making anyone heroes here, but some of the people who go and leave their elderly at the hospital, you know, we may be angry with them and we look down on them, but in some cases, that is an act of love, because many of them recognize they do not have the means to care for their loved ones. Many of them recognize that I can't stay home any longer. And so the best thing to do with mommy or daddy is to put them somewhere where at least somebody will care for them. So we have to be empathetic when those things happen as well. And so I think that the focus here in this policy ought to jolt us as a nation to realize this is an area we need to pay more attention to, because many a young person has had to forfeit his or her personal development for the love of mom or dad. And there's nothing wrong with borrowing from other places, but I see a policy in the United States now where you're actually being paid to stay at home and care for your elderly. I don't know where we'll get the resources to do that, but I think that that's a good policy as well. So these are things that we can look at. And just as important, the policy also touches the environment. And in touching the environment, it raises the issue of balance. Yes, we want to get a larger workforce so that persons can contribute. But we also have to do that against the availability of resources. And one of the things we must be cognizant of is that Barbados is a water-scarce country. And so we have to now balance how we're going to maintain adequate levels of all our natural resources while trying to get this population at a level that can be productive. And so, having said all of that, I want to commend the drafters of the policy, but also to remind us, on this, the cusp of our independence, and I'm speaking through you, sir, to persons out there. It was Barrington Levy who said, to all the rude boys, it's time to put down your weapons. Because the problems we have with our population, look at how many young people we're losing. The flower of Barbadian youth. The ones who should be reproducing the great nation. These are the people that are being lost every day in some of the most heinous ways. You know, and so I want to call us as a nation to a moment of reflection. We can't continue like this. I've said this before, but we just can't. Too many of our young people are being lost. And through nonsense. I believe that this policy this population policy is calling us as a nation to look at ourselves and ask ourselves, as former Prime Minister and now national hero would have asked, what is our mirror image? Is it the same thing as it was way back in the 1960s when we started this journey? Do we have that same passion? Do we still have that willingness to go beyond the call of duty because our nation needs us? Or have we become so individualistic in our reproductive choices, in our work life, in our community life, in everything, so that we no longer think about community, but we think about self? If we're going to reshape this nation and guide it to attain the greatness for which it was destined, it requires all of us to recognize that we have a critical role to play in national development. For the young people out there who are looking at life and think that I do not need any children, I don't want any children, I hate them, because many young people tell you that. I do not want any children, they're too noisy. I would say, but somebody endured your noise. Somebody cared for you. And maybe it comes from the sense of community that we've created or lack thereof. But I want to encourage us to build a new Barbados. And the new Barbados may not look like the one that we had before. It may mean that we may have a larger migrant population. The culture may be shaped in a little different way, but there are some core things that we can hold on to, which is the genuine care for the other, decency, a sense of national pride, and faith. I think a lot of people discount the importance of faith in building what we have as a nation now. The church of which I'm a part came to this country just under 400 years ago with the first settlers. It had a checkered past. A lot of negative things were done in its name, but also a lot of positive things. It helped to shape the community. It helped to shape what became our culture. And whether we recognize it or not, an integral part of Barbadian culture was our faith. Church and Sunday was sacred. You do not play any banjo on Sunday. And I remember when I came back here in 1987, sir, one of the things that shocked me was how, as soon as Ash Wednesday came, the whole tone of every radio station changed. The music was solemn. Everything was respected. But then I began to see the changes. I believe it was 1989 when we had our first Good Friday Fete. I can hear it being advertised still. Yeah, Sunday used to be a rest day on test matches too. So, and everything just changed. The whole culture changed. And it reached a height a few weeks ago, sir, when I was preparing to go down for my 6 a.m. mass. And around 5 o'clock, I heard all this commotion in the community. Noise, blaring, jam music. And I said, on Sunday morning, what's happening? This nightclub, like it forgot to close. I went to church because my wife warned me, you make sure you go straight to church. Don't go play you looking for nobody to. I wasn't going anywhere. Only to find out that some of my members said when they were coming, the street was blocked because there was a street jam on Sunday morning. Maybe they were Adventists. I don't, no, they were not Adventists. Sorry, my Adventist friends. They were not Adventists. And I know they were not Adventists because when I came out of church at 7, I was going to another church, and I saw how they were dressed, and they were definitely not Adventists. They were adventurers, or adventurous. I've just said that to say that a lot has changed. And we have to start building community again. And we have to build community around faith, which is grounded in family life, as the building blocks of our community. So once again, I wish to commend the government and commend the drafters of this policy and fully support the proposals that have been set here. It's for us now to put things into action. So I thank you very much for the time, sir.
Thank you, Senator Reverend Canon Dr. Rogers. More speakers?
You speaking?
Senator Andrew Boyce.
Thank you, Mr. President, for recognizing me. Given the late hour, I will try not to be as expansive as I had intended to sort of be. Mr. President, as I was reading this national policy, I thought to myself, if you had asked the average Barbadian 6 or 7 years ago what some of the most pressing challenges that face them were, I'm not sure that the multiple and interrelated challenges of population would feature prominently on that list. That notwithstanding, the government of Barbados had the foresight to craft the document that is now before us, and more particularly to recognize that if these challenges and issues went unaddressed, that they had the capacity to impact, to compromise what we take this country to be and what we hope that it will continue to be. And so it is in that context that I wish to add my voice to the commendations for the commissioners who I think have done generational work both in scope and in impact. Sir. Sir, I have to admit that I entirely enjoyed reading this national policy because I think bound up in this population policy are achievements of this country, achievements of this administration, aspirations of this country, and aspirations of this administration. And then there are some truths with which we must grapple. And so as I went through the policy, sir, you saw the Barbados that you hoped would take shape, the Barbados that is in the midst of becoming also take shape, Mr. President. I will focus my comments, Mr. President, almost exclusively on the building of the care economy, because that is an essential tenet of this national policy. I say I enjoyed reading the document, sir, and one of those reasons specifically was that as I was reading the document, there was a cohesion of policy from this document to much of the work that the government of Barbados is currently engaged in. I specifically refer, sir, to things like the care of the elderly, Barbados has, in the last few years, made significant investment in the care of the elderly, in the construction of the geriatric hospital, in the crafting of a community elder care program, and in the contemplation in the future construction of respite centers. And no doubt, sir, this comes at a time when many Barbadians are grappling with the realities of care. Grappling with the realities of how to balance those care responsibilities with professional responsibilities, and trying to make good on what we take to be the moral imperative of caring for generations that cared for us, while also being productive citizens and workers. I use that example to talk about the elderly, but that is also true for persons with disabilities. As you know, sir, I was a member of the Committee for Improving the Lives of Persons with Disabilities, and I say all the time that one of the more searing memories of the last few years sitting on that committee was one night at the Dighton Griffith School in consultation with a group of mostly women, mostly mothers of autistic children, and hearing them share their stories around how they balance caring for their child in many instances where they don't have a support system, in many instances where the fathers are not there, and balancing that responsibility with their professional responsibilities. Suffice it to say, sir, I'm almost compelled to also quote popular culture and say that it is not an easy road for them. Many of those women, Mr. President, shared the stories of trying to get their child ready in the morning and enduring what in any other context would be considered abuse and assault. But having to go out, after that experience, having to go out into the world and be productive. It is not an easy road. And it is why the government of Barbados has recently contemplated, you heard the Honorable Prime Minister speak to it as the lower chamber debated the national policy on disability, the crafting of the establishment of respite centers also for persons with disabilities. Sir, and then there is, of course, the policy also contemplates incentives and tax benefits for persons across various sectors. Also in the area of disability, Mr. President, coming out of the last estimates and budget process, we know that there was an expansion of the disability benefit to 4 new categories of persons with disabilities. A recognition that care costs, and that a person caring for certainly particular categories of persons with disabilities, depending on the severity, may from time to time be compromised in their economic standing, to put it as charitably as I can. And so those are the investments that the government of Barbados is making around our care economy. I want to join the Honourable Senator, Reverend Dr. John Rogers, Cannon, my apologies, when he says that our businesses, our private sector need to create a better culture, more inclusive culture for families. Mr. President, I chuckle all the time at the notion that during COVID, we mastered the art, those of us who could, of working from home. And it was just the way things were. In the period since, though, there has been a call to come back to the office, a call to come back to whatever your quarters may be. And as we contemplate building up care infrastructure, as we contemplate, Mr. President, creating systems that permit people the space to care for their elderly, for their disabled, for their children, Mr. President, we may need to re-inspire the collective imagination that led us to work from home and think again, to look again at the allowances that we created at that time, sir. Because I think that no doubt, I think the data tells us that productivity did not suffer any large degree because we were working from our studies or kitchen tables. And perhaps we need to think again and to, I think, do the right thing in relation to permitting people the space to do that which they need to do. Mr. President, there have also been investments, as you know, in child protection and in child justice, sir. And bound up in those policies are also notions of family and the stability of our family. Those reforms to the legislative system are really aimed at ensuring the stability of our familial relations as best we can, even when things go wrong. And I think that those are also investments in care and in people, Mr. President, necessary investments in people, and the government of Barbados ought to be commended for those efforts, but also for the policy cohesion that we see and the through line that we see running through both this document and so much else that the government is doing and contemplating at this moment. Because very often, those of us in the social policy space will complain about policy isolation, right? Where a government commits to doing population, to meeting a set of population targets, but you only see those ambitions reflected in population policy. Not so with this administration, because policy by policy, legislation by legislation, you're seeing a commitment to care that runs through so much of the work that the government is doing. Mr. President, I said I don't intend to be long, and so there are Perhaps only two other submissions that I would wish to make in relation to this issue. The policy also contemplates, Mr. President, access to health care. And we heard just a moment ago reflections on sexual and reproductive health and the ways in which we need to improve our appreciation of sexual and reproductive health, Mr. President. Let me say this. We have had a culture in this country of silence in relation to sexual and reproductive health. And if any of this policy is going to make any sense, certainly the tenets around sexual and reproductive health, we are going to have to change that. We're going to have to shift away from that, Mr. President. And that is going to require a number of things. One of them, in my view, is age-appropriate, comprehensive sexuality education. And I know when you say that, sometimes it inspires some angst. I hope that I will get some reprieve on this eve of independence. Sir, comprehensive sexuality education, life skills education should run through all of the nation's institutions, the church, the school, our social groups and social clubs, Mr. President. And very often when we talk about comprehensive education, sexuality education, we talk almost exclusively about children, right? Because that is the thing that is sexy, for want of a better term. It inspires, angst. But I think no doubt, sir, that it is essential for it to run through all of our institutions and for it to be happening across the lifespan and life cycle. The data tells us that there are information deficits throughout the life cycle, right? The ignorance, in the proper use of that term, that a child or an adolescent may have does not disappear when they become 18 or 21, Mr. President. And so I think there has to be space across our institutions to talk about these issues, to confront them. I think there is space, no doubt, for, as we grapple with things like STIs, but also as we grapple with things like gender-based violence. Quite ironically, or entirely by happenstance, we're having this conversation in the midst of the 16 days of activism to end gender-based violence. And what if our institutions were better at having these conversations with not only women, but men as well, with a view to cauterizing the unmentionables. I said before that there's so much that we don't talk about, yes? And what if we reimagined institutions, schools and churches and community groups in a way that permitted space for these kinds of conversations? I think the time is now, Mr. President. Sir, the other issue, the other truth that I think that we have to tell ourselves is that there is work attached to the silence to which I referred. There is work that we have to do in the legislative and policy space. I think for far too long, Mr. President, Barbados has permitted what SRH advocates refer to as that 16-18 disparity. The difference between the age of consent and the age of medical independence. Suffice it to say, Mr. President, that I think that we need to apply our collective imagination to solving it. There is no room in a Barbados that is about to celebrate its 58th anniversary for that kind of ignorance in the proper use of the term. The idea, sir, that an adolescent at 16 can consent to sexual activity, but is precluded from independently seeking medical attention is it is literally a nonsense. Mr. President, this House, this chamber, and the government of Barbados has benefited extensively in recent years from the work of the Law Reform Commission. And I think that that commission would be well placed, certainly in my view, to grappling with these issues and to, in furtherance of this national policy on disability, fixing these issues. Sir, there is one more issue, one more truth, and then I'll take my seat. And it is the issue of access to SRH for members of the disabled community. Sexual and reproductive health, information and education and access for members of the disabled community. Mr. President, the prevailing sentiment in this country, even sometimes held by medical practitioners and doctors and nurses and others, is that members of the community should not have access to their sexual and reproductive rights. And we do this, the stories, I refer to being a member of the Committee for Improving the Lives of Persons with Disabilities, the women and sometimes men who told us stories of interfacing with doctors in both the public and private sector and hearing, why are you here? Pregnant women, so what you gonna do with this child now? What you gonna do this for? It is something that we need to apply our best efforts to stopping, Mr. President. When we talk about access to our public facilities and to public services, we often think about the physical environment, right? Like, do you have a ramp? Do you have an accessible bathroom? But our conception of access also has to meet the issues of training, and it also has to meet the issues of perceptions and stereotypes, Mr. President, with a view to making those spaces as accessible as possible. In addition to that, I will make a call for things like the training of medical professionals in things like sign language. Because imagine going into a clinic with the intention or the need to speak to a medical professional about, you know, your innermost activity, if you will, and there's a language barrier, yeah? Or you have to take someone with you who you may not wish to take in other circumstances to explain, to interpret, rather. Mr. President, these are the conversations that we need to have to breathe life, to breathe more life into this population policy. I commend the government of Barbados for its foresight. I commend the government of Barbados for its foresight. I commit, Mr. President, celebrate a Barbados on the eve of its independence that is doing and committed to doing this generational work. And may we continue that work, and may we always find the moral courage to tell ourselves the difficult truths. Mr. President, I thank you.
Thank you very much, Senator Andrew Boyce. Senator Blackman.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. I rise to wrap up this debate on the resolution of the population policy. And I would wish to commend everyone who took the floor and spoke on a matter of significant importance to Barbados. And as you've heard, this discussion and debate took place within the context of the future of the country, our population needs, but as has also come out, and as also has been suggested, not just the socio and economic aspect of it, but also the focus on how can we ensure that the livelihoods of our nation and our citizens and residents takes place in a holistic way going forward. And it allows me to express gratitude for the contributions. I also want to make note of Senator Walters' remarks. We often, more often than not, we don't agree on policy matters. But this afternoon, no, but hold on. But this afternoon, I heard from him, perhaps for the first time, and I suspect as he charts out his path within his own party, it was a reflection of things to come. And therefore, he gave us a new flavor and not the usual script that he was given to him. And therefore, I welcome that sort of debate from the honourable member, because I believe that in time to come, we will see a new dawn. But let me also pay homage to, or I can only be me. Let me also pay homage to Reverend Dr. Cannon Rogers for his intervention, and also placing squarely some of the societal perspectives that we must confront as we treat the population, as we treat to our women, as we treat to our society, and a lot of the vulnerabilities that oftentimes go unchecked or not necessarily unnoticed, but not given necessarily the spotlight in which they need. And in his usual eloquence, he charted, in my view, a framework for consideration also on the eve of our independence. And to my fellow government senator, Senator Boyce, for capturing perfectly some of the challenges, but equally opportunities he's outlined for consideration for those amongst us who are not just vulnerable, but really looking at how can we treat to a lot of the gaps that are filled when it looks to the issues to sexual reproductive health. And therefore, Mr. President, I just want to take this opportunity to wish fellow Barbadians a happy independence, a happy Republic Day tomorrow. And once again to wish Shirley Chisholm a centenary happy birthday. And as we look to build up this population, as we look to build up this country, that we can continue to see the gains and growth and stability that we've enjoyed, underscored by a population that punches above its weight here and abroad and wherever we go. And Mr. President, I'd like to beg that this resolution be now passed.
The question is that this resolution, the Parliament of Barbados take note of the Barbados Population Policy 2023, do no pass. Those honourable senators in favour, please say aye. Aye. Those against, please say no. The ayes have it. This resolution is therefore passed.
Order number 7, sir. Name of the Honourable Leader in the Senate. To move the second reading of this Sexual Offences Bill 2024.
Senator Cummins.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. The hour is late, and I know it's the night before Independence Day, and it's coming up to the Christmas season, and I've already been threatened by at least one colleague that I am going to be on their Grinch list. But I have given them the assurance that I want to make sure that I'm not on their Grinch list by not keeping us here at Christmas by making us suffer through on a night like tonight. So bear with me, guys. So, colleagues, I rise on this occasion to take us through the sexual offences bill, which is before us, the amendments which are there. I'm not going to go into a lengthy discourse on the bill. I believe that the bill has been on the order paper in the other place and in this one for some time, and so I'm confident that honourable members have had an opportunity to peruse the substance of the bill. Simply put, Mr. President, this is an old piece of legislation, but not as old as some of the others. 1992 was when it first came into effect, but it was a case that was held far more recently that caused one particular section to be called into question. Section 12 of the existing legislation
Senator Morris, just be a little more quiet. Okay, I can hear you out here. I know you weren't speaking loudly, you just have a voice that flows so smoothly through the ear. Continue, Senator Cummins.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. Now, there was a case that was brought before the courts in Barbados, and there was a question of the constitutionality of a particular section of the bill. While the government did not attempt to appeal the ruling, there was one section of it that the government felt was inadvertently spoken to, and as a result, these amendments arise here today. The situation that the government found itself was that, as it stood, without any action on the part of the government, while it would have taken one particular section of the legislation out of operation, it, however, did not put the government in a position where certain types of activity, in particular with children under the age of 16, could be treated to in the way in which we would expect it needed to be. And so the amendments are being brought, and you will hear another presentation that will go into the legal details of that very shortly. But the amendment is being made to ensure that the relevant protections are there for persons under 16. But in amending the legislation, the legal team led by the Attorney General took the opportunity to go a little bit further and to address a number of items. It addressed, in particular then, in new sections of the legislation, items relating to persons who, for example, were being termed in the previous legislation an idiot, an imbecile, or mentally subnormal. Those are not words that are part of our vernacular, and certainly if we heard Senator Andrele Boy speaking in previous debates or even in an earlier discussion, the way in which we treat to persons and the way we speak about people is not going to be reflected in words such as this. It was found that these words were offensive and the opportunity was taken to remove them. There was also, Mr. President, a new element which was included that was not there, and certainly for those of us with children, nieces, nephews, neighbors, the question of grooming, men, women, seeing young children, encouraging them with sweets, with enticements of different sorts, flattery, bringing them into their confidence and appearing to show them love and attention, affection, only for the purpose of preparing them for sexual exploitation. The term grooming has now been inserted into the legislation as we have made these changes. And so these are some of the new elements which were not there. So this modernizes the legislation as it relates to sexual offenses. But it also then goes on, Mr. President, to speak to the persons with some kind of mental or physical disorder where those persons cannot understand the nature of the act being done to them, or they can't decide whether the act should take place or not, whether they want to engage in it or not. And so these are the elements that have been included in the new legislation. And so on that basis, Mr. President, in a very, perhaps my shortest presentation to this chamber, out of deference to my honorable colleagues, this is the matter for the consideration of the chamber, and I beg to move that this bill now be read a second time.
Senator Worrell.
Thank you, Mr. President. And I rise to make a contribution to the amendment to the Sexual Offences Act. And at this late hour, I will try to be as concise as possible. I really should be, at this time, rapping conkeys and stuff like that, but... But anyhow, I will try to make my contribution. Now, and more so not necessarily on the issues in the amendment, some of which are very important, but in this week or last week, we received a report that from Dr. Tanya, a lecturer at the University of the West Indies, right, with Barbados being one of the 4 countries globally with the highest incidence of rape. This was said by the head of the Institute of Gender Development at the University of the West Indies. And in particular, you have sexual violence in terms of partner relations. So this it brings the importance of this legislation, and hopefully for us to have a debate on what is actually happening within our country. And there are certain aspects of the bill that I wanted to speak to.